Hi everyone, it's Jenny at JC Cards and I'm super excited to be joining you today as part of the Altenew August 2019 Build-A-Flower Bellflower release. This is part of a blog hop. I've given a link in the description box below to my blog post which has all the stops on the hop as well as details of giveaways. I've got a couple of other cards on my blog post, but today I'm going to be featuring this card in my video as well as some tips for using layered stamps. All of the supplies and a link to the Build-A-Flower subscription are in the description box below. So here's a quick look at what you get as part of this Bellflower release. You get a large stamp set and the coordinating dies. The stamp set's great, it's got labels on it so it shows you from A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6 which layers go first, and you've got 4 layers to each of the main florals plus a couple of layers for each of these stems. And then if you open out the packaging, it has a layering guide as well as lots of tips on how to compose your cards and tips for colour combos. So you'll notice that each of the florals comprises of 2 parts, the petals which are layered separately to the stem at the base of the petals which have 2 layers to them. And the dies coordinate exactly with the final combined image. So in order to be able to line up my stamping exactly, I've die cut out the actual panels of the dies first, and I'm doing this once for the main flower and then twice for the smaller blooms. I'm then going to place those pieces back in. You won't see it here, but I've added a little bit of dry adhesive on the back glue runner before I put it into my MISTI. And then that way I can perfectly line up each of the layers of the stamps, and when I lift it up you'll see it doesn't pull up the cardstock. So for my first layer I'm going to be using Frosty Pink. So we're going from light to dark, and in the stamp set this is the first layer. So you'll see it's A1, B1 and C1. And these are really easy to line up. You can just look at the outline of the die cut in the way that I'm doing it here and line up those pointy pieces and the base. And if any of the images don't stamp perfectly like you saw there, you can just go back in and re-stamp. I'm doing it in my MISTI this way as well because all of my flowers are going to be the same colour, so it helps me, I can ink up my stamp layers much quicker. And then I'll go back in and stamp the other 2 blooms again by lining them up in the same way. I just didn't show that in the video. Now for my second layer I'm using Coral Berry, and I have let my first layer dry in between for about a minute or 2, and I find that you get much better contrast between the 2 different colours if you let the first layer dry. Otherwise there tends to be a bit of a blending together of the colours, I find. That may be your preference, but I'm looking for a really deep contrast on these layers here. Now I'm going back in and lining up my third layer, picking it up with my MISTI and going for a darker colour. This time I'm using Ruby Red and inking it up as I did before, and I have again let it dry for about a minute in between each stamping, and it helps that I'm actually repositioning the stamps to stamp the second of each of the florals at the top. That helps the drying time without adding too much hanging about and waiting. I'm now going in with my 4th layer. This is the last layer for the buds themselves, and if you were just stamping this directly onto a panel you probably could just stop here. You wouldn't necessarily even need to stamp the bud leaf base. That's completely optional as well. There's quite a lot of versatility to this stamp set. So for my 4th layer, my darkest layer, I'm going for Grapevine and stamping it down. And if you head on over to my blog, you'll see another card I created with this stamp set where I added some pencil accents after I did my stamping. And it helps to soften the look of the stamping so that it kind of does blend the layers into each other a little bit more. And it also helped me to add a bit more contrast and depth and shadows into areas that aren't necessarily there from the initial stamping. I'm now going in with the base of the stem. I'm lining it up, and it makes it super easy to do because we've already die cut our images, and you can just pop these in. They fit really well at the base of your petals. And I'm stamping this first layer with Frayed Leaf, which is the lightest layer, and then I'm going back in with the second layer with some Evergreen, which is a darker green. And again, I've let them dry for about a minute in between each stamping. And you can see just by using your MISTI here, you can save a lot of time on what is quite a complicated layering stamp. Now there is a stamen on this main bloom and it has 2 layers to it as well. I've stamped one in yellow and then one in a darker orange. And another tip for you stamping this main stem, I've gone ahead and die cut it again and added some tape runner in the back just to make sure it doesn't lift up when we do our stamping. And this actually is something I like to do with longer, more bendier stamps. I like to use my MISTI because especially when you're die cutting them, there's quite a risk that these stamps, they tend to bend out of shape. So if you stamp it first, then try and die cut it, you might find that your die doesn't quite fit your image. And doing it this way round really helps you to get a perfectly lined up stem, if you take a look at that. And I use frayed leaf just to stamp this. In one of my other cards that you can see over on my blog, I actually did a little bit of ink ombre blending on that stem and added a couple of other layers of green to it. Now for my base, I'm using a panel of watercolor cardstock here and doing a bit of ink blending with some yellow, some of the coral berry, some of the ruby red and some of the grapevine. And then I'm going to go in with some Altenew ink spray and just tap that over. This is also in ruby red and it's got a really pretty shimmer to it. This just adds a little bit of interest to the background. So I'm first off tapping just the spray nozzle and then I'll come back and for a slightly finer droplet tap it on top of a paintbrush. And then I'm going to set that aside to dry. Once it's dry, I'm going to die cut it with the Dotted Scales Debossing cover plate die. And I'm going to run it through my die cutting machine. This doesn't actually cut out the pattern. You can see it just debosses and gives some really cool interest to this background panel. I'm now going to use this Fine Frames die and die cut it from Altenew Mirror Gold cardstock. And you're left with this. These are really cool because you can actually separate them out as you see I'm doing here. I want 2 or 3 of these to form the background, to go on the back of my panel. So I'm just popping them out, and then to keep them adhered together, I'm cutting some really fine strips of foam tape, just slightly narrower than the 3 frames, and putting that all the way around, and then I'll peel it off and adhere it to my background panel. Now I'm going to speed this bit up next, and I'm just going to be using foam squares and the really thin amount of foam tape to adhere my Bellflower and putting it all together. And don't forget, if you run out of ideas of how to put this together, there's that sheet inside the stamp set that gives you lots of different combos of how to put that Bellflower together, as well as all the stops on this hop with tons of different other ideas. So you'll see I'm just using lots of foam squares here to adhere down my flowers, and in the end I decided not to use the second of the smallest buds. I was going to pop it up near the top, but I decided not to in the end. I'm then going to adhere my entire panel onto a Nina Solar White 110 card base. For my sentiment, I'm using a strip of black cardstock and this Sentiment Strips stamp set from Altenew. I've chosen the You're Amazing, and I'm going to be stamping it down with some embossing ink. I've used my powder tool just to treat that black cardstock first so I don't get any embossing powder sticking where I don't want it, and then I've heat embossed it in white, and I'm just heating it up with my heat gun and then trimming it out. I've popped it up on foam tape just either side of that gold frame, and then I'm going to trim off the overhanging floral so it fits inside an envelope. And as a finishing touch, I'm adding some Nouveau drops in Morning Dew. I like to add these either as an embellishment like I'm doing here, but also as almost water droplets on petals, as you can see here. And that finishes the card. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. Here's a couple of other videos you might enjoy. I hope you have an awesome day. Bye!